This story contains depictions of violence and the brutal realities of slavery. If that is likely to trouble you, please take care before continuing. My name is Florinda. I spent 15 years standing over a pot of boiling water, scrubbing and rinsing the lives of other people until the skin on my hands read like a map of labor. The steam from those vats taught me the measure of my days. It rose in the morning, wrapped the house by noon, and cooked the air through the long afternoons. I learned the language of heat, how a flame creaks when it wants more wood, how a lid will sing when the kettle nears a boil, how water remembers everything poured into it. We worked in Monte Alegre, in the Val do Paraíba, a house made of whitewashed pride and secret cruelties. This is the account I kept to keep somebody's memory honest, of what was done to me, and of what I did in return. If you value untold histories, subscribe for more stories from behind the facades of power. The laundry was the heart of that house, and the place they thought least likely to carry a rebellion. They never imagined the washerwoman kept a mind as sharp as the irons. There were 6 iron vats in a row, each a black mouth on a brick hearth. We fed them with split logs, cut small so the flames would die down slow and steady. We fed the vats with our mornings and our afternoons. The clothes, linen for the bedclothes, cotton for shirts, the fine muslins Donna Constanza favored, went in white and came out whiter than the sun, as if bleaching could scrub away the marks of our existence. We rose before dawn. The smoke from the fornalhas would show in the fields like a promise. I would wade barefoot on the packed earth, clutching a bundle of linens, and lower my arms into that dark, steaming water. My hands learned the weight of a shirt when it had soaked in alkaline, the way a skirt would cling when the starch had set. Fingers long as river reeds became calloused, then split, then numb. The palms gathered permanent lines, ridges that spoke of repeated motion, of wrists that never rested. When the season was right and the cotton hummed with harvest, we worked until the lamplight sagged. The rest of the household ate by candles while we rinsed and wrung and lifted the wet meaning of their lives. Coronel Joaquim Silveira owned Monte Alegre in name as he owned the land and the people on it. His shadow was felt more in decrees than in presence. His wife, Donna Constanza, lived in a different world, a world of polished doorknobs and exacting measurements. She kept the house like a ledger. Every shirt folded on her table had to align by a hair's breadth, every sheet with its corners tucked like a secret. The worth of a thing at Monte Alegre was decided by its lack of blemish. Where everything in their home was allowed to appear immaculate, our bodies were allowed nothing of the sort. The white of their linen shone against the darkened work-skins in a way that seemed to say, "Here is what belongs to me, there is what pays for it." Donna Constanza had a face made for inspection. Her eyes were small and sharp, never lingering in the places where people might hide. She walked the laundry on certain mornings, as others walk a garden, checking hems as if she were plucking weeds. She loved hot water. She trusted heat. Perhaps she believed it revealed truth. Perhaps it soothed a particular superstition in her bones. For her, cleanliness was not merely convenience, it was a demonstration. If she could command whiteness, she had ordered the world. When she inspected, she did not speak. She gestured. A raised eyebrow was an indictment. A slow shake of the head was a sentence. Tia Rosa sat near the door of the wash-house, the oldest of us, and her voice was a low bell in the clamor. She had been at Monte Alegre longer than I had been alive, longer than Coronel Joaquim had sat in his chair. She told stories the way some people tell prayers, short, sharp, and meant to keep us steady. "You keep your hands soft for your body," she would say. And that was her code for conserving each small dignity. She braided other girls' hair, mended the shirts of those who could not pay, and told the young ones to mind their tongues. Her hands were riddled with white scars that looked like the maps left when the river withdrew. She taught me how to bind a burn and how to hide a bruise from a quick-sighted mistress. We had names among ourselves, small sanctuaries of self, but in the house we were often only tools, buckets, irons, boilers, and teeth for the work. There were days the work ground into us until we were less than memory. Once, after the rains washed the path into mud, the coronel's boots left prints on my sleeve, and Donna Constanza laughed as if the fabric were a joke. She took a towel I was carrying, twisted it, and flung a stone at the bundle with all the idle cruelty of someone cleaning away discomfort. The stone tore a hole. She squinted at it as if inspecting a blemish on a fruit. The gesture was small to her. To me it was a ledger entry in shame. Punishments at Monte Alegre were intentional and inventive. There were tasks assigned whose only point was to humiliate, to polish cast iron until your knuckles bled for a single sparkle to her eye, to wring a shirt until your wrists ached so she could feel your obedience. There were times she insisted on testing our endurance. She would bring a towel to the laundry and snap it at us, the sharp sound like a verdict. When someone dropped a sheet by accident, she gathered us and made the offender stand with a brick on her head while the rest of us crossed our arms and chanted the names of saints until the hands of the clock slid by. These were the punishments that branded you not for the act, but for being. They made shame into an instrument. I learned quickly which humiliations could be swallowed and which would poison me. The ones you could bear without showing pain, you could bargain with later for a softer edge. The ones that struck at the heart of my person, when she made us hold our palms while she laughed at the cracks in our skin, left a residue that could not be wiped clean. For a long time I kept my sorrow folded like linens, pressed in the back of my mind until it was flat and manageable. Tia Rosa saw the pressure building behind my eyes and taught me breathing that did not attract attention. "Remember," she said, "the work is the work. The harm is their harm." She did not pretend this made it right. The day that shifted the ledger was in December, when the air was still soft and the house smelled of guava. It was a day we would otherwise recall for the heat. Donna Constanza came to the laundry in the middle of her staking out rituals. She wore her white gloves and had the expression of someone arriving to approve a harvest. She wanted the large sheet inspected in a way that suggested some private pleasure in folding imperfection like a confession. I had been at the nearest vat, stirring the lye so it would stay even. The steam rose and the wood popped in the fornalha. I remember the taste of the air then, metal and starch, and the faint smoke of orange peel from the kitchen. I remember being asked to test the water's temperature. She did not ask gently. "Florinda," she said, the name like a bell that tolls to call a body to account. "Show me the heat." There was an eagerness in that command that made the air between us denser than steam. She liked to see how close she could bring us to the edge without letting us fall. Without looking up from my work, at her insistence or at my own fatigue, I pushed my hands in to touch the water. I felt the scalding first like the peel of an unripe fruit, then a hotness that did not stop at the skin but went inward and down into the bone. She laughed, not in the small way of amusement, but with a cackle that rang in the beams. "Not yet," she said, stepping back so the pain could be catalogued like a specimen. The house brought in the barber, as if we could be patched with clean blades. A surgeon, if that is what someone in a town like Vasuras could be called, sutured small tears in my skin and prayed with a tone of pity that smelled like vinegar. They wrapped my hands in linen and poultices, words of consolation and orders to keep my hands bandaged. The burn left its signature. The skin tightened, the fingers stiffened. The first winter felt like an effort to learn to be alive in a different costume. The fingers, once instruments of rhythm and toil, betrayed me with numbness and an ache that rose when the moon changed. When the skin fell from my hands, something else fell into place. It was not an awakening like the sudden flare of a trumpet. It was quieter, colder, and more precise. I began to watch. The way she moved the lids when she came to the laundry revealed more than cleanliness. It spoke of a trust in ritual, of predictability. She insisted that certain vats be boiled at certain temperatures, that the great cauldron be used only for the largest sheets because its heat could singe a seam beyond repair. She had a routine that was a kind of choreography, the timing of her inspections, the order she wanted the sheets laid, the time she would cross from the veranda to the laundry and glance at each woman as if taking attendance. I mapped these patterns the way I mapped stains. The injury changed me from someone resigned to someone who noted details for reasons other than survival. I watched the coronel's men move the wood, watched João Feitor, our foreman, a man who liked to puzzle things into lines, measure the amount of hot water and mark it in the ledger. João was a plain man, not cruel in the way his mistress was, but complicit in the system that made cruelty routine. He gestured with a certain economy, and sometimes when he left the laundry, I would see the crease between his brows like a small regret. I could not fix my hands by begging him. His sympathy had borders as strict as his orders. There were small moments that hinted at the architecture of violence. Once, while scrubbing a sheet at the second vat, I caught Donna Constanza fingering the corner of a tablecloth with an attention that suggested she believed the linen contained the family's honor. She breathed close to the cloth, as one might inhale a relic. Her obsession with spotless fabric had an almost religious quality, and that is how I learned to weaponize the ordinary. If whiteness was her altar, then heat was her sacrament. Heat was what she trusted. Heat was what she taught me to know down to the feel of a pulse. If there was to be an answer, it would be shaped by that same ritual. Tia Rosa noticed my watching, and did not rebuke me. Instead, she told me an old story, one you hear from those who have seen too much and lived, about a woman who folded her life into a pot and boiled away the things that had eaten her. She did not laugh. Her mouth set small. "Careful, child," she said. "If you warm yourself to a thing, it will warm you back or burn you." The edge of her voice was the geography of the choice I was learning I might make. I felt less like a single hand, and more like the slow accumulation of all the hands that had been called to account and received no answer. After the burn, the house's rhythm broke and reassembled itself in ways I could see and also not. My hands healed, but they healed with a bureaucracy of pain. I could no longer lift the large irons with the same ease. The weight of them told me stories of every wrong ever done. I found other things to do in the margins, the kind of tasks that make you invisible until you are needed. Mending a tear behind a gown, cleaning the dust from under a doorknob, learning the exact pitch of a voice that would call someone to the veranda. I learned when the coronel would be in the study and when the mistress would find the time to inspect. I memorized the back ways of the house as children memorize a suite. When someone asked me once in those early months of my changed life whether I wanted to run, I laughed a laugh that had no humor. There was no escaping. Monte Alegre sat on land as firm as gravity, with neighbors and roads and the way the law called people back to their owners. There was also a knowledge in me that anger and sorrow are not the same thing. Anger can be a bright flame that consumes without giving shape. Sorrow is a black ember that keeps a steadier fire. I let sorrow smolder and watched it for patterns for the moment when it might be harnessed. The catalyst to a different kind of thinking came slowly, one terrible piece at a time. There were afternoons when Donna Constanza would stand by the vats and breathe in the steam like a benediction. She would stir a pot with the slow patience of someone preparing tea, and at times she would absent-mindedly test the drop of a cloth against the water. She trusted that the water would show her truth. She believed there was no dishonesty in heat. If I was to think of retaliation, if I was to entertain such a thought, I had to square it with the cost. Violence changes the shape of those who wield it. It is a lens that corrodes as it clarifies. I did not let my fantasies run into cruelty for cruelty's sake. I imagined a strict economy of moral accounting. What did the law do when the law itself was part of the harm? What did I, in that small room of steam, possess as power? The answer was simple and terrible. Knowledge of routine, and of where heat could be coaxed to kill. I began to lay plans the way one lays a blanket, folding, aligning, being careful not to show rough edges. It was not an act of theatrics. It was arithmetic. The largest cauldron was the one used for the great sheets and blankets. It was wide enough that a body, if unfortunate, could be submerged. The heat needed to be right, hot enough to scald in an instant, but not so much as to make an accident impossible. I watched the wood piles and learned their seams, which logs burned longer, which coals held their warmth through the afternoon. I took note of the times the coronel liked his drinks and how the foreman moved to fetch them. I noted which doors clicked and which servants kept the keys. Preparation is a quieter kind of murder than stories allow. It was in the small things, a pole left by a vat for stirring, a knotted rope that had once held a laundry line, a folded letter of instruction I would sometimes tuck in my apron to make the gesture of working appear as unremarkable as breathing. I stoked fires at odd times and observed how they settled, took the measure of the steam when the lid was left a finger's breadth ajar. I did not write diagrams in the mud. I wrote them in my hands, I traced measures on the heel of my palm, and rewrote them in the tenderness of an absent moment. I measured courage as one measures wood, by density and by burn. The decisive moment, the one that split the before and after in me, arrived not as a lightning bolt but as a slow bruise. It was the morning she came to the laundry with a new kind of cruelty disguised as a test. She demanded that I bring forth the linen she wanted, and when I did, she took one sheet, held it to the light, and said it was not white enough. Her voice carried a kind of satisfaction in condemning. I had been called many names in that house: lazy, careless, incompetent. Names are like smoke. They sting, they blur the eyes, but they pass. This naming felt like a verdict that detached my person from any claim to dignity. When she ordered me to test the water again, with a smile that might have been sweetness in another life, I felt something in me click like a hinge. A no left my mouth that day. It was the smallest sound, a syllable like a stone dropped into a bucket, yet it carried the weight of all the small humiliations. It was not a dramatic refusal. It was a quiet denial that shook the room in a way she did not expect. Her eyes narrowed. She commanded again. I refused. The refusal took the last measure of patience out of her. She stepped closer and struck me with the flat of her hand, not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough to pronounce domain. The pain was not the point. The point was to announce to everyone present that her will was the measure of bodies. That hand did something to me that every other insult had not. It crystallized the ledger. It converted humiliation into a debt that could be repaid in kind or erased in some other way. I did not react in rashness. Instead, I retreated into calculation. I watched her return to the house and plotted the moments when she would be off guard. I catalogued the afternoon in which João Feito took his siesta, the hours when the coronel lingered at the veranda, recounting some distant harvest, the time when the house would be thin with people and thick with trust. I sought counsel in the only person whose counsel in that house carried more weight than their fear of retribution. I went to Tia Rosa, who sat by the back hearth and ground coffee with fingers that trembled less now when she touched the wood. Her eyes met mine with a kindness that did not soften the truth. "You carry a fire inside you," she said, folding the coffee into the pan. "You may warm someone or you may burn them. You must know what you will be when it is done." We spoke in the language the house allowed us, sparse words tucked between the fabric of work. We discussed the likelihood of discovery, the small witnesses whose ears picked up stray confessions like Maria's, the legal world beyond the gates that would never be our friend. She reminded me of the way the law worked. The law served the owners and the order, and where it did not, it would still make theatre of our punishment. "If you choose," Tia said, "you must choose to accept what follows. We are not cowards, nor are we fools." I told her I understood. I understood in the way sorrow can make a woman precise. There was another thing to watch, how the house itself resisted change. It was constructed to absorb heat and return it. The bricks retained warmth for hours. The hearth leaked a complicated sound when the wood had reached the right point. I spent nights imagining the cauldron's temperature, not to teach another person how to imitate me, but to know my own capacity. I practiced the manipulation of lids when no one watched, the way a seamstress practices sewing stitches that will never be seen. I began to put things in place. A pole used for stirring the vats was sharpened at one end and tucked behind the shed where the smoke could not find it quickly. I learned to lean it casually when the mistress walked by, so it looked like natural clutter. I rearranged the wood to favor longer burning logs beneath the largest vat. At times I shut my eyes and felt the imagined weight of a woman's body in the boiling water, the closing of a lid. If anything would be the end, I told myself, it must be as quick as possible. The idea of mercy sat in my mouth like an unripe fruit. I did not indulge in fantasies of spectacle. I wanted clarity, not cruelty. There were practical matters. I stole small things only when necessary. A length of rope from the attic one day when João Feito was away, a strip of cloth to tie the pole when hands needed both. Every theft felt like a sacrament because it was taking back the household's own measure of labor. It is a strange thing to be meticulous when planning a deed that will cost everything. Perhaps that is the peculiar mercy of being a person who has had to calculate survival by the hour. You make certain choices with a sweated calm that looks like resignation, but is really a refusal to be hurried. In those weeks before the act, I practiced a face like the day. I learned to put on a blankness, to maneuver small talk when the mistress passed, to hand her the shirts she liked folded a certain way. When she praised a hem, I answered with a low bow and a yes, Donna, and met her eyes with nothing that could betray the plans folded like a handkerchief inside my apron. The house believed me obedient. It is easier for a house to be fooled than to be surprised. It does not have imagination, only patterns. But even as I prepared, the night carried its own counsels. At times I woke and thought of the children in the quarter, the ones who would grow wondering if the world had ever been different. I thought of Tia Rosa, who had known other things that boiled away. I thought of the coronel's laugh and the way his voice carried like a proclamation. I thought of the priest, who came sometimes to give the house the soft varnish of piety. Every thought was a weighing stone. I kept asking myself, will the ledger be balanced by the act, or will it tilt into some other darkness? The question had no neat arithmetic. One afternoon, as the sun leaned west and the smell of starch thickened the air, I found a moment when the house thinned in its vigilance. The foreman had the habit of dozing in the back room after lunch. The coronel took his wine with the neighbors, and the maid who watched the front steps had gone to fetch something for the mistress. Donna Constanza had a habit of inspecting alone, as if her ritual required witness only from herself. I watched her from the corner where the steam painted halos around our shoulders. She moved with the slow certainty of the privileged. She closed her fingers around a cloth and held it to the light. I did not rush. The pole I had prepared rested near the big cauldron, disguised among the stirring tools. The logs I had arranged were dry and eager. The vat itself, when empty, looked like the mouth of a well. I felt the gravity of the moment press at my chest like a hand. In those final acts of preparation, I thought of the price of the choice, not only the immediate, but the long tale that would drag me through courts and ritualized shame, the way the authorities would make my person a plaything for their jurisprudence. I thought of what Tia Rosa had said about the difference between warming and burning. I lit the coals, then fed them. Each log I added asked a question of me. Are you sure? Heat spread, slow as a thought. I closed the lid to keep the steam and listened to its small complaint. The house held its breath. I arranged the boards where I could move without being seen. I practiced the motions in the back of my mind until they were as smooth as peeling a fruit. I noticed the tremor in my hands and told myself it was only the memory of pain. I told myself that the ledger needed settling. Then Donna Constanza entered the laundry as she did so often, unannounced and exact. The door made its particular sound that I had catalogued, a wooden click, a slight squeak if the hinges were dry, the whisper of silk as she moved. She had that look of inspection, and for a moment, only a moment, I remembered our early years when work and service had meaning that did not burn us. Memory can be a knife that cuts both ways. I folded it away and stepped forward with my hands in the work-worn way, with the quiet face of someone accustomed to carrying burdens. The water in the vat hissed. My fingers grazed the lid to test the steam's pulse as I had practiced, and my heart beat a stuttering rhythm against my ribs. I felt the whole of Monte Alegre pressing in through the rafters, the rooms where secrets lived, the veranda where laughter sometimes rose like a false flag, the congregation of things that would miss a woman only when she was gone. I remembered the nights when Tia Rosa told me to lie still and breathe. I remembered the heat of the day I had been burned. I could not pretend I was free from the knowledge of what must happen next, nor could I pretend my hands had not been counting the cost of this hour for a long time. The moment held like a held breath. The pot was hot. The house was thin with people elsewhere. The pole rested where it had been hidden. I reached for it with the same gentle certainty I used to lift damp linens, my fingers steady, despite the tremor beneath the skin. The steam rose and the laundry smelled of guava peel and starch, and the old smoke of the fornalha. I stepped closer to the vat, to the sound of water that kept its secrets until the right time. I set the pole into my hands like setting a ledger on a table, deliberate, steady, not triumphant. The wood fit my grip, the way a familiar tool fits calloused fingers. The steam thickened as if to hide us both. She stood a pace from the vat, peering at the sheet with that slow, exacting look. For a heartbeat I tasted the guava and starch and the iron tang that always lived in the laundry. Then I moved. I called her name. "Donna," I said, soft as a prayer and as ordinary as the air. She looked up. pleased perhaps to be summoned into the machinery of her own perfection. I offered the cloth she had held, arranged it between my palms with the practiced tenderness of a woman who has spent years making things neat. The noise of the house fell away and left only the hiss of the lid and the small, secret calculus of breath. Her hand lifted as if to touch the fabric one last time. She did not see the pole because her eyes were fixed on white. I slid close with the same motion I had used 1,000 times to lay linen over the edge of the vat. The pole met my palm as if it belonged there. I put my shoulder into the movement and used the rhythm of work to make the moment a continuation of the day. The world narrowed to the sound of steam and the pressure in my arms. I gave the push like one gives a stubborn bucket loose, a single, clean motion. The sheet slipped. She stumbled. There was no fight in her. There was only the surprise of a woman who had been taught the world would never rise against her. She fell forward. The lid caught and swung. Water struck the air, a sharp, surprised sound. Steam roared up like a white curtain. I put the pole down and held what had to be held. I pressed as I had pressed other things in other hours, with hands that once measured the weight of shirts and the pull of rope, with an insistence that was not sudden but had been accumulating for 15 years. Her sleeves were wet, the steam wrapped her, and for a breath she made a sound, an astonished short cry that was not yet a name. It is difficult to write about that moment without the language of drama, and I will not feed drama for its own appetite. There was no glory in it. There was a tiny, impossible cleanness in the motion, a closing to the ledger, a quiet accounting. I thought of all the small adjustments, the flints of humiliation, the lists of chores that amounted to humiliation catalogued every week. I thought of my hands when they first learned to protest. I held until the sound that was a cry thinned into nothing. Then I stopped. I set her gently, as I would have set a heavy sheet upon a line, and spoken the name of the saint under my breath. I ripped the pole from the place where it had been holding weight, and I cried out, loud, raw, used like a tool. "Help! Help!" I called, my voice the rattle of someone who had been caught with a spill. I ran to the veranda where the house's nerve lived, and banged on wood with the urgency of an accident. The household answered as households answer. A scramble, a confusion, the coronel's boots heavy on the boards, João Feitor's face drawn with the suddenness of trouble. They arrived in a pack, men that had the comfort of command in their bearing. The sight of Dona Constanza slumped halfway into the vat pulled the air out of them like a hand from a bag. João's eyes went narrow, not with suspicion, but with a need to manage, to do what foremen do, make a disaster smaller. He shoved hands, barked orders. The coronel took in the scene with a flicker of something like proprietorial trespass. This, he seemed to think, was a thing that had gone wrong on his estate and would bear a bill. I stood with my face wet from the steam, my palms smelling of starch and smoke. I offered the simplest story, an accident, a misstep, a moment of carelessness. I was arranging the sheet and she— My voice broke in the telling, not from feigned sorrow, but because sorrow will break even the hardest face. They listened in practical increments, first shock, then management, then the thin search for someone to blame before they blamed the object that required attention. João feigned the dignity of authority and called for water, for rags, for the surgeon. He ordered 2 of the younger ones to hold the body, while others fetched the priest. I fell into the motion the house wanted from me, hands steady enough to wring a towel, eyes lowered. I let them dress me with concern and ask questions that required answers I had practiced. Where had I been standing? How had the pole been placed? Why had the lid been ajar? I gave the answers with the small, mechanical detail of someone who knew that if you are to survive, you must be believable. Word carried across the property like a rumor. Neighbors came to the gate. The coronel's friends wanted to know if the day would be ruined, if dinners would be delayed. The house's gossip bent toward inconvenience. People clustered at a respectful distance, blinking under the sun. There were whispers about how strange accidents could be, about how even the most obedient of servitors could make mistakes when hot water is involved. They said the word tragic. They said unfortunate. They did not yet speak of motive. When the priest arrived, Padre Antonio, a man with more softness than the coronel liked, and a voice that made even punishment sound like a sacrament, He moved through the room like an offering. He touched hands, spoke a few words of prayer in a language of pity. He asked for the truth in that round, calm voice. I told him what I had told Joan, that it was an accident. I sealed the speech with tears that came from the place in the chest where sorrow and calculation meet. The priest pressed his hand to my head and said, "God sees all." His words felt a blessing and a verdict. The first hours after were a haze of tending, of the surgeon's rough, tidy incisions, of stitches and the turning of faces that wanted to be kept away from the scene. They put Donna Constanza's body on a stretcher and took her to the room where the family saved for such things. The coronel barked small orders, his voice the creak of a wheel out of True. Joan looked at me with something like suspicion in his eyes, but he also saw what a foreman sees, the need for a neat narrative. He nodded at me as if to say, "Keep to what we have decided." I nodded back. It is a strange comfort when others set the terms of your lying. But there was, as Tia Rosa had warned, and as I had expected, the small ears that pick up what is not meant for them. Maria, the maid who carried messages and who had a habit of lingering where the household secrets leaked, stood at the edge of the commotion. She had been there when I handled the pole earlier that morning. She had seen the way I left the wood piled. She had a soft mouth and a quick reporting habit. Later, when the coronel's men were consolidating the scene and the neighbors had been given their fill of drama, she found a quiet spot and repeated what she had seen to the man who smelled of authority. Capitão Moreira, the local officer. She made it small. She made it factual. She had seen Florinda near the vat a moment before. She had seen the pole. She had noted how the lid had been ajar. The rest she left to inference. Once an accusation moves into the hands of law, the world tightens. Capitão Moreira arrived with the kind of formal decisiveness that belonged to men who knew the ways of confession and of the ledger of property. He looked at me as if measuring a commodity. He questioned me in the cool way of men who have read the scripts of guilt in the posture of accused. His questions were precise. Did I mean her harm? Had I argued with the mistress earlier? The answers do not need volume to convict. They need to suggest vulnerability or depravity, and the rest will be filled in by the assumptions men carry about people like me. I told him the story I had told before, a misstep, a slip, an accident. But Maria's memory and the whisper of my recent refusals worked against the shape I'd created. Someone mentioned the way I had said no. Someone else recalled the burn I had suffered months before. These were not neutral facts. They were brushstrokes a prosecutor could color. Capitão Moreira's gaze steadied when I did not weep in the theatrical way of the desperately innocent. He noted how I answered and how the facts arranged themselves in the book of suspicion. When they took me from the house, it was not to a dungeon but to a sort of custody, the sort of place where the law keeps hands while it decides what they are worth. The rooms were plain, the bed rough. I sat on the edge and thought, as I had thought when burning pain first rewired my days, about the sum of the ledger. I had expected to be found out. I had expected the shape of punishment the house reserves for those who break its rules. I had also expected, or rather accepted, that an act done in the name of some inward measure would not be met with the same inward measure by outward law. The interrogation that followed was less about finding truth than about making truth fit into the categories the magistrates knew. Capitão Moreira asked about motive, about opportunity, about whether I had been overheard speaking of harm. He wanted concrete phrases, I might have said. He wanted evidence, and Maria had given them what she had. I answered, I did not give them the whole of my thinking. To answer fully would be to tell them to take more than they already had. I told the priest in our private moments that I had acted out of a particular kind of justice. He sighed and said he had to tell God the state of my soul. I told him then, plainly, what many have told a priest before me, that I knew what I had done and that I had thought through what would come after. The examination moved like a machine, witness to witness, statement to statement. The coroner gave his version, tone contained, grief measured, anger kept in the place where owners keep such things. He spoke of household order, of what it meant to be disrupted. João Feito recited exact times as if reading a weather report. Maria, when she was brought in to speak, looked at me and saw in my face what she had seen that afternoon, a woman who had been part of the machinery and who had then in a moment been someone else. She did not intend malice, I believe. She intended truth as she saw it. When the news of my confession came, because in the end I did confess, it arrived like a simple fact to the men who needed the machinery of the state to move forward. I did not think confession was a clever tactic. I thought it the only honest account I had to offer. I went before Capitão Moreira, and in a voice that had been built on years of restraint, I said what I had done and why. I did it, I told them. I held her down. I could not stand the way she held me. I did it to stop the ledger from making me less than a person. They recorded the words. The formal language of the law wrapped them in something heavier than their plainness. Where I thought the words might be read as a breaking, as the open of the wound, they were received as evidence and set in the files. The prosecutor took them and began to make of them the skeleton he needed for a charge. The trial, if the court that convened can be called by a word that implies balance, was brief. In those days, when an enslaved person stood accused, the proceedings moved with efficient disregard for nuance. The world outside the courthouse had been arranged to prefer stability over justice. Evidence that might have complicated matters, my burn, the pattern of cruelty, the particular tyranny of a mistress, was offered as background at best and as provocation at worst. The man's death had to be accounted for. The law had to be seen to run. In that hour, the law was both theatre and instrument. Capitão Moreira called witnesses. The coroner sat impassive, the pallor of a man whose property had been injured. His grief took the shape demanded of him. João Feitor spoke about schedules and woodpiles. Maria gave her account, and the prosecutor used her testimony to paint me as a restless, angry woman who had been waiting for an opportunity. The defense that could have contextualized my act, my years of service, the burn that had altered my hands, the way the mistress had stretched humiliation into art, was minimal, muted, translated into the language of fatalism. People in the courtroom nodded as if they were watching an old play. When the verdict came, I read it in the quiet way one reads the weather. Guilty. Sentence death. There was an economy to the decision. The state needs spectacles. It needs the example of punishment to preserve its order. The coroner's estate had to be assured that justice would be swift and certain. I had no legal recourse. I could have asked for mercy. I could have asked for deliberation. I did not. The idea of asking for mercy from the same structure that had permitted and demanded my degradation felt like petitioning the very thing that owed me recompense. I would not pretend a posture of supplication I did not feel. They allowed a few visits. Padre Antonio came more than once. He read the scriptures with a softness I had not expected and asked me questions about sin and redemption. I answered honestly. I told him that I had no illusions about heaven or hell as rewards for my act. I told him that I had loved my life even when it hurt, and that there was a kind of love in taking responsibility without charm. He prayed and said he would remember me in the Mass. I accepted that small solace, as one might accept a glass of water on a long road, grateful for the relief, though it could not change the distance to be walked. Letters came in dribs and drabs. Tia Rosa visited in the dark hours and sat with me until my voice held no more stories. Her hands touched mine, and the touch carried all the seemings of our shared labor. "You have done what you thought was right," she said. There was no congratulation in it, only the steadiness of someone who had lived through more than one reckoning. She told me about the women who had gone before, about ways people had kept memory even when they were not permitted to claim it. She told me to hold myself as I held a bone steady and useful. On the morning of the execution, the square was full. The crowd came as crowds always do, for curiosity, for the justice of order, for the taut satisfaction of seeing a conclusion. The coroner insisted the spectacle be public. There was a bench for the neighbors, and a place for those who came from the neighboring fazendas to be reminded of what happens when property resists. The judge read the sentence aloud in the cold way of legal phrases. The rope that would end me lay coiled like a neat catalogue of the day's business. I dressed in clothes they gave me, plain, sober, and wrapped my hands in linen one last time. Padre Antonio stood by and spoke words the way he had done in the laundry, softly with a steadiness that felt like a small mercy. I thought of Tia Rosa, and of the women who had taught me how to endure, of the little sanctuaries of names we had carved out for ourselves. I thought of Maria and João, and the coronel, and the steam that had taught me the measure of days. When I walked out, the air bit the skin like honesty. The assembly watched with a dispassionate hunger that had been practiced by generations. There were placards of propriety and the small, polite exclamations. They had made the day into a lesson. I reached the gallows with the ease of someone who had practiced the motions of a lifetime and accepted the geometry of what was to come. The noose fit like a book in need of binding. The executioner, who wore the face of a man who had done his work many times, adjusted the knot with an efficiency that made the crowd shudder. I thought then of the meaning of the word finish. In the laundry, to finish a sheet is to make it ready for use, to restore an object to its purpose. In the place where I stood, finish had another shape, a closing of the physical ledger, an end to the entries. I did not seek to transform this end into martyrdom. It was what it was. I had chosen the cost. I looked out at the faces and tried to name them kindly in my head. There was the coronel, his expression a blank ledger. João, who looked like a man measured by his utility. Maria, with eyes pearl bright. There were villagers whose faces I had glimpsed while carrying wicker baskets, shopkeepers, neighbors, and a scattering of women who had come perhaps out of a private sympathy. Padre Antonio touched my hand and whispered a blessing. I closed my eyes and breathed. Before the rope tightened, I spoke. My voice carried, and in that small moment I aimed it like a cloth at the sun. I did what I thought the law would not, I said. I did it because no other law answered me. Take note of what you make tidy. It was not a speech meant to inflame, it was a provision, the crowd murmured. Some seemed to sense a crack where certainty was supposed to be solid. Others kept the lesson the law wanted to teach. When the drop came, the world narrowed to a single all-purpose sensation, wait and release. The mechanics of it are not a drama to be lingered over. I will say only that as the body does what the rope orders, the mind condenses into a small, bright clarity. There is a forward and backward in memory, faces the taste of guava in the air, Tia Rosa's hand, and then a detachment that is both terrible and oddly clean. I remember thinking that the ledger had been closed on one page, and that the book would still be read. They buried me in the common grave reserved for those who had no family plot or for whom the law had made a place of shame. The earth there is nameless. Tia Rosa could not go with me beyond a certain point. They would not allow it. She stood on the periphery and watched the shovel fall. I imagined her hands, calloused and small, folding a cloth with the same tenderness she had shown me. Later she told stories to those who would listen, and her voice made me continue in a kind of afterlife. Word does what word always does. It arrives and expands. The story of me and the vat moved like steam through the Vale do Paraíba and beyond. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the audacity of servants. Others told it as a legend of righteous retribution. The versions grew, as versions do. Where one man saw crime, another saw justice. In the quarters, where hunger and memory share a small space, I became a figure both feared and whispered about, Aunt Florinda, the washerwoman who boiled the mistress alive. People began to attach to the story the kinds of details memory loves. A particular cry under the full moon, the way the laundry stood empty for years and the birds nested in the eaves, the smell of starch that lingered in winter. There were rumors of strange deaths on neighboring fazendas, a mistress who fell ill after handling a sheet, a foreman who met with misfortune on the road. These tales took on the shape of folklore because they needed to. Folklore is a way people keep score when courts will not. It is a method of justice for the remembered. The physical traces of Monte Alegre changed over the years. The laundry, once the heart of the estate, decayed and was eventually demolished. People said it was because of rot and neglect. Others said it was because brick and wood could not hold the memory of what had happened there. Tia Rosa lived long enough to see slavery end by law in 1888, though emancipation came too late to heal many wounds. She died quietly with a handful of women around her who remembered the names of those who had been lost. Her voice kept my story alive in a way the courts had not, as a memory with edges and warmth. As the decades passed, The figure of Aunt Florinda shifted into other shapes. In some tellings I was monstrous, in others a spirit of retribution. In Afro-Brazilian circles, older women sometimes invoked me as a caution and as a remembrance, a spirit who balanced ledger and law in ways human courts would not. My life, which had been ordinary and brutal in equal measure, became a symbol for something larger, the small engines of resistance that thrummed in the backs of houses and in the spaces where the oppressed kept one another alive. Scholars and old papers found and folded into the tale have tried to iron out the contours between legend and record. Municipal notes, court rolls and parish entries offer fragments, dates, names, an execution date recorded in January of 1875 that many have taken to be the final punctuation of my story. Where the archives show ink, memory adds voice. Where the files are thin, folklore fills the emptiness with the rich color of narrative. It is important to say plainly that the historicity of some details is debated. Some documents bear my name, others are silent. Part of the power of my story is precisely this border between proof and the human need to remember. And memory, as Tia Rosa taught, is not a single thing. It is a room with many doors. Some of those doors lead to anger, others to consolation. People who work in archives will tell you what they can confirm. People who carry tradition will tell you how the story shaped their community. Both are true in their ways. The danger is to turn either one into the sole truth and pretend all other ways of knowing can be trimmed away. If there is a moral to be drawn, and I do not like to hand morals as if they were shirts pressed for the table, it is this. Laws are not the same as justice. A well-kept house can be a tyranny. A neat sheet can be a verdict. The ledger tastes of paper, of numbers, and of rationality. Justice tastes of something more like repair or accounting, which is not always found in the court's slow arithmetic. I did not believe the law would save me or my hands. I also did not believe that moral courage is a clean currency. It leaves stains. I accept that my act cost lives and left wounds that would reverberate past me. I accept it because I believed in the marrow of my days that action was necessary. Over the years, people made poems and songs about me. They told me as a ghost story to children and as an anecdote in the markets. Some used the name as a warning. Do not press the humble too far. Others used it as a memory cushion to soften the edges of their own guilt. In Afro-Brazilian memory, where the past and spirit live side by side, Aunt Florinda became a figure who taught a kind of austere justice, a reminder that those who are invisible in a household have power in the daily details, and that power can, in extremity, be turned toward ending a harm that official channels ignore. So I do not claim to be a saint. I do not ask for pity. My life was made of hard days and small victories and a final decision that cost me everything. What I ask is that the world be seen whole, that the hands that did the ironing be counted not only in the crimes they were accused of, but in the brutal tally of what they endured. If my story can make some small reckoning of that weight, then perhaps the ledger is a little more balanced. People often ask, those who visit the region, the curious with their notebooks, where the line between truth and legend sits. My own answer is simple. Both are necessary. The archives can tell you when a sentence was read and who signed it. The stories people repeat will tell you why a person like me came to a place where she felt she had no other language to speak. If you are moved to know more, the public records in the municipal offices and the recollections preserved in families of the Vale do Paraíba will offer pieces. Look for both. Look, the laundry at Monte Alegre is gone now, replaced by new structures or by fields that bear other crops. The people who remember me by name are fewer each year, but Tia Rosa's grandchildren still whisper the story of the woman who would not be tamed, and in that whisper there is something that survives, a lesson, a warning, a lament. It is not a simple tale of villain or victim. It is about the human cost of a system that claims ownership over persons and the strange, terrible ways that ownership can breed resistance. If you sit in a quiet place and imagine the steam rising from a vat, think of it as both obscuration and revelation. It hides and it exposes. It taught me to read the house the way a woman reads a map. If you remember anything from this tale, I ask you to remember the names of those whose labor made other lives possible. Remember that dignity can be stripped by small indifference. Remember also that when systems have no answer, humans will sometimes make their own. For those who want to explore the records and the context behind this story, I've left notes in the places the living keep their files. There are municipal entries, parish notes, and oral histories, collected by those who worry that memory will die if it is not tended. If this story moved you, please consider reading further. The documents are both sparse and revealing in equal measure, and they help place the tale where it sits between archive and folklore. If you have stayed with me through this telling, subscribe to hear more stories that walk the thin line between official record and the human heart. Learn what else the corners of history hide. I will leave you with a last thought, not as a moral but as a gesture. People ask whether I regretted it at the end. The truth is that regret and conviction can sit in the same chest like two stones. Some nights I thought of what might have been, a life with less pressure, a hand not burned, a different set of choices. Other nights I held the memory of the mistress's laughter and the ledger of indignities, and felt that whatever my fate, it had been chosen with a kind of sober intent. In the end, the story is not a manual for action. It is a remembrance of how far a person will carry hurt when no other hand offers the remedy. May the memory of those who toiled be kept with the gravity they deserve. May the names of the forgotten be spoken into the spaces where they were kept silent. And may the future learn to measure justice not only in law, but in the small acts that make life bearable for those whose labor upholds the world. Thank you for listening. If you want to read more about the history, the contested records and the oral traditions that preserve this narrative, links to sources and suggested readings are in the description. Subscribe to continue exploring stories that reveal what power hides behind the housekeeping of the world.